All right, it looks like we're starting to have people join. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Action Lab for Nature-Based and Ocean Rights. There we go. All right. Before we dive in, I just want to recap really what we heard from some of the interviews and set the stage for our discussion. So to begin, I think it's helpful to just contrast our traditional environmental legal system with that of rights of nature framework that we'll talk more about. In Western environmental law, nature is largely valued as a resource and property for human use. And so as a result, environmental laws and policies, they have a very anthropocentric or human-centered frame. So they treat humans as above and separate from nature. And as a result, the standards for decision-making within these laws, they're based on human benefit and utility. So we allow pollution and degradation to continue in the long term if we see short-term gain or profit. And lastly, I believe Glenn spoke to this a little, is there's a lack of representation of nature herself in decision-making. We're not considering nature's intrinsic worth or considering her as a stakeholder in decisions that affect her health. So rights of nature is emerging as just one solution to address this flawed legal and governance system. This framework, it recognizes and protects in law nature's inherent rights, either as a whole or by recognizing the legal personhood of an ecosystem. It draws from indigenous people's worldview, and it maintains that, we're a part of nature, we're not separate from it. And this idea of kinship with the natural world that Dan speaks to. As a result, standards for decision-making under a rights of nature framework, we can consider them higher, more protective, and really evaluated holistically, looking at, the entire ecosystem and its constituting elements. So this framework, it really helps to give standing to nature. It allows human representation of nature, its ecosystem, its intrinsic value to be considered in decisions and disputes that affect its health. Next slide, please. So how can we reverse the tide and restore ocean health? Despite the multitude of laws designed to protect ocean health, it's declining, and it's declining pretty fast. So can we aim higher and strive for thriving ecosystems and a better relationship with the ocean? How can we ensure principles of kinship, interconnectedness, stewardship, and precaution are all included in our governance frameworks going forward? How can we strive for this healthy looking coral reef ecosystem that we have in this photo here? Next slide, please. Can it be as simple or as difficult, depending on how you look at it, as changing our worldview? We have campaigns and policies emerging internationally to advance the rights-based approach to land-based ecosystems, but also ocean conservation. We're seeing this emerge in Ecuador, the Cook Islands, and New Zealand, for example. And I hope we'll have time to delve into a few of these examples today as we hear from our environmental justice campaigners on this question of whether or not and how can we give the ocean a voice and offer it a seat at the discussion table. So to help us get to this answer, I've set 3 questions for us all to think about as we go through our discussion. We'll also put these in the chat as the slide goes away so that we have those for reference. But in thinking about this larger picture of, can we give the ocean a voice? What processes would have to be in place? What will be the challenges in doing so? And what are some ways we can look at to give the ocean a voice within our existing legal systems? And perhaps, any examples within each other's work that we're seeing. So what I would like to do now is turn to our panelists first and get our thoughts flowing, the discussion started, and then, like I said, with about 10 minutes left, if you have any questions or if you would like to, weigh in as well, feel free to raise your hand or ask to be promoted to a panelist, I will signal when that is, like I said. Thank you. So to start us off, I'm hoping that Dan from New Zealand will kick us off. Please introduce yourself as well, and feel free to also pose any more questions for our panelists as well. So if we could spotlight Dan, if he's okay with that. Yeah, there we go.
Oh, kia ora tātou, ngā mihi o te ata mai Aotearoa, o te rangi kia koutou I te wā nui. So greetings from the early morning in New Zealand and to the early afternoon for the rest of you around the world. And thanks for setting this panel up so well, Michelle. I think in response to those three questions, one of the real challenges at the moment of having voice of the ocean or voice of nature, or at least for voice of the ocean, is the UNCLOS, is the Convention of the Law of the Sea. And although it's never stated explicitly within it, it assumes the concept of mare nullius to be true, mare nullius being the maritime equivalent of terra nullius, which was the rationale upon which states were colonized. And we also colonized the ocean. And so from an Indigenous perspective, the ocean is not empty, as the framing of mare nullius would perhaps purport. The ocean was in fact the great connector. It was seen as the great marae, the great meeting place of Polynesian peoples. It was it was an ancestor, or she's personified, and there is so much knowledge and information around it. And I believe it was just assumed to be empty because that was a framing of the dominant legal system that came into place. So the challenge we face is to demonstrate that the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea is based on a flawed legal assumption. And concurrently, we can say that, in fact, there's other ways of knowing the ocean. There are other worldviews and there are other knowledge bases. And that we can all begin to feed into those. And then the last question you had was, the existing structures. In New Zealand right now, we're really looking into the ocean to try and think about this personhood idea. Very soon we'll have a volcano, or a dormant volcano will be given legal personality. And we're really looking into that ocean space. It's interesting because we have differences in legal framings in our in the extended economic exclusive zone and in the territorial sea. And so the difference will be trying to go from that nation state out into that open ocean space. I mean, even the framing of it, it's the common heritage of mankind. I mean, that language just seems so dated now. I mean, we need to move beyond that. So I'll stop there and hand the rako, hand the speaking stick on to the next person. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Dan, for kicking us off. I think that will also bring up some more questions and discussion we have, especially when it comes to UNCLOS. Next, perhaps if we can turn to Olivia Swat-Goldman from the Wildlife Justice Commission. Like I said, feel free to introduce yourself a little bit more as well.
Hi, thanks so much for including the Wildlife Justice Commission in this really interesting panel and this really interesting discussion about how we can ensure that we aren't destroying our biodiversity and the oceans in particular. And just to build off what Dan said, which is, it's true, states have traditionally been the subject of international law. So international law hasn't looked at other forms, and it was really already a big movement by the time individuals got rights. So it's a long and arduous process, I imagine, before we're going to be finding a way to give the ocean legal status, but there's some great work being done on it. And while that process is happening, it's really important that we continue to look at what the tools that we already have and to be applying those at the same time that we're working on expanding the rights. Because like UNCLOS, another relevant treaty is CITES, which is about the trade in endangered species, including those in the ocean. And again, the perspective is, what can we do to nature rather than that nature has any rights in of itself. How do we trade in these endangered species, including from the ocean, that in a way that doesn't destroy them to such an extent that we can't use them anymore? So it's really about the trade. And what we should be doing is looking at other tools and laws that we have that we can apply to stop this devastation. So we're at risk of losing 1 million species. This is devastation. And one of the main causes of that is human interaction. And one of the main causes of human interaction is the illegal wildlife trade and trade in endangered species on fauna and flora. So we can look at some of the existing legal frameworks and see if we can apply them. For example, the Convention on Organized Crime and the Convention on Corruption. So while we're facing the very difficult challenges of creating a new form of rights for the ocean and other forms of nature, we should be at the same time looking at how to apply maybe some more creative legal regimes than have traditionally been applied to protect these areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think many people completely agree with that, and there's really ways to evolve what we're currently doing to sort of get us in that direction. Thank you so much, Olivia.
Thank you.
Next, we will turn to Glenn Edney, Ocean Spirit. Spotlight.
Hey. Okay, so yeah, kia ora koutou everyone. Wonderful to be here. So the idea of a legal framework, I think, as you just said, Olivia, you know, this could be a long and arduous process, and the time frame of working through that long and arduous process may actually be too long for us. So I think there's something underneath that we need to move on as well. And you know, I just made a note. When we are looking at treaties, when we're looking at, as Dan mentioned before, you know, the idea that we had this empty ocean that was, you know, just there for the taking. That kind of thinking has evolved into what I like to think of as this externalized management psyche, where we consider our interactions with the world from this management perspective. So we are the managers, we're the planetary managers, and in this case we're the ocean managers. So that the underlying aspect of thinking in this way, this external management way, is that not only are we once again separate over and above, but we are self-interested in this process. And so I like to think of things in terms of self-management. And when I think about this, I also think about the whole planet. Now, I studied Gaia theory with one of the people who worked with James Lovelock on the development of Gaia theory, and what the understanding around self-management on a planetary scale is simply staggeringly beautiful. Can we bring this idea of self-management back to ourselves and understand that the idea of self-management doesn't just mean, okay, I'll just manage my small discrete self, but this is actually the global scale of things, is self-management. And so when we are thinking about making decisions for ourselves, for others, or decisions that may affect others, we have to think of it in terms that we're not separate from all of those others. And so when it comes to things like UNCLOS and so on, can we move to this non-separated way of thinking about management? So let's think about self-management as the global thing, as the interconnected thing, rather than this idea of an externalized management system. I think I'll just leave it at that, because so much more we could talk about in that regard.
Oh, there is, certainly. And I think, you know, that's certainly a topic of discussion just on its own, is how can we look at decision making with humans as a part of the system rather than outside of it. is a key aspect of this work in advancing ocean rights. Thank you so much, Glenn. Next, we will turn to Jessica Van Uter, Youth Ambassador for the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature.
Yes, thank you, Michelle, for giving me the floor, and thank you for being a part of this great session. So I won't repeat the legal story that have been touched upon by Dan, Olivia, and Glenn, but I just say that in order to implement rights of nature, we need to gain political will as well. And as a youth ambassador, I'm really glad to be a part of this movement where we try, not only to let the Earth system's voices be heard, but also those of the youth. And what I've been trying myself to do is to connect the rights of nature movement to the climate justice movement, which has been very a hot topic amongst us youngsters. So rights of nature could also be a way in accelerating climate justice lawsuits. So rights of nature could be a more direct way to represent our interests and to defend our rights instead of, for example, in the Netherlands, we've got a climate justice case where we try to establish, climate justice through human rights. And I think it would be so much more efficient if nature has rights itself, and then we can establish a more direct link, really. And I've also been recognized as an Earth-centered law expert for the United Nations. And in my capacity, I am outlining the global trends on rights of nature across the world. And what I've noticed is that it's so great to see that rights of nature has developed, for the 50 years in our existence, from moving to South America to New Zealand, and now the movement is spreading to Europe and even Africa. Uganda adopted rights of nature, so it's great to see this movement spreading so fast. And I don't think it's just the rights of nature in a legal sense that's important, but it's also through policies and education efforts, and especially education is key here for us youngsters as well. So especially in Europe, for example, we see that education is playing a bigger role in rights of nature. So in Sweden, we've got multiple initiatives going on. Munta Ito recently put forward a directive by the European Union on rights of nature. So I think we're moving ahead greatly, and I'm really glad to be a part of that. So I'll just leave that for the floor as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jessica. Well, we have about 10 minutes left in the session, actually, so this is perfect timing to open up to more discussion, more questions that we may have from the rest of the panelists and attendees. So what I think will work best is just raise your hand. Yes, so I see one hand. Eric.
Yes, if you can hear me, thank you. I'm Eric van Spiel. I'm a physical oceanographer from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. I'm a physicist, of course, so I don't really have that much experience with law, but it's been a fascinating discussion so far here. What I would want to bring into this discussion is, I think one of the unique things about the ocean is that it is in constant motion. It's constantly moving around. So anything that is in the ocean is never at the same place. And if you think about normal jurisdictions and the way that the law system is organized, it has created all these kind of like random barriers, EEZs, all these kind of things that the ocean doesn't care for, because the ocean currents move stuff from A to B. And we've seen now, especially with the plastic problem, that anybody's plastic can end up anywhere else. And I think especially in terms of liability, that is something that we really need to think about how to deal with this.
Right, that's one of the hardest parts, right? And that's, Dan said, I believe too, mentioning this idea of common heritage of mankind, that's pretty outdated at this point, and how can we think about it more, and our new understanding of what the ocean is and how it cycles and how it functions. Let's see, I'm looking for
Michelle,
other we may have. Yes.
Just a quick response to that question as well. I absolutely think we need to argue and fight for the rights of nature. I also think we need to also look within ourselves and think about our obligations to nature as well. And I think I'm completely with you, Jessica, that we need to get a program of people reconnecting and finding themselves back in a relationship, falling back in love with the ocean, and then they will care about it, and then they'll have a sense of obligation to do things. And so there's as much the rights of nature, so that if someone does pollute her, we can actually say, you're out of line, we're going to do something. But also there's the obligation from yourself to do better, to do things, to not pollute her.
Right. And I think that's one key thing about, you know, rights of nature is, I saw a question, is there a clear roadmap? And I don't think there isn't. You know, our idea about this framework is constantly evolving, and we're seeing the different approaches where we actually do put rights in law. And then there's other ways, you know, that Dan mentioned, you know, they're not talking about rights, but legal personality, worldview, values, and understanding that have been traditional knowledge of Indigenous people without talking about rights. So rights is really, you know, just one way that I think Western culture and society can understand and try to honor this like idea of obligation and responsibilities. We have a hand up by Bronwyn, right? Bronwyn?
Sí, kia ora koutou katoa, another New Zealander, and just to say it's a pleasure to have my fellow citizens participating. I just want to take up Dan's point about UNCLOS, which I think for many of us who work in the ocean space is seen as a really significant instrument, despite recognizing the limitations in the construct that Dan has addressed. But I think really important in there is that there's an article in UNCLOS that calls upon all states, all governments, and all citizens, and it says that we are obligated. It obligates us to preserve and protect the ocean, and I think that's the part of UNCLOS that has been lost. That the focus on maritime security, on borders, on extraction, on exploitation has become the dominant voice, and what we forgot in there is the piece that Dan just alluded to in his last comment, is our obligation to that ocean space, irrespective of our boundaries, our borders, our desire to extract economic value, is that document also calls on us to preserve and protect the ocean. And it seems like we've forgotten that, and it seems that the word governance and guardianship, which I think are two really important words in this conversation, the sharing of knowledge, the bringing together of the past, the present, and the future in terms of how we engage with the ocean is really, really important. So while sweeping away UNCLOS and thinking about how we might replace it has value, I think even more is our need to remember our obligation as a layer of UNCLOS, and to see ourselves as guardians, and to think not about new constructs, but new forms of governance, or indeed perhaps going back to old forms of government where the oceans was a commons that we shared and that we respected. So if I was to leave you with 3 words for the ocean, it would be the respect that we need to have for it, the guardianship we provide for it, and the new forms of governance that we need to think about providing for it. Thanks.
Thank you. That was great. Do we have any responses to what Bronwyn said, or any other questions right now? Richard. See a hand up. Are we able to let Richard speak?
How's that? Is that better? Here we go. So Richard Mason, I'm an employee of the Ocean Race, long-time ocean racer and environmental scientist. But I think to build on a little bit, that one of the key things is going to be education of the next generation and calling people out. I've had the opportunity to go into some of the remote corners of the earth, and you see countries extracting. You see people fishing in places you wouldn't expect to see them at all, in the depths of the Southern Ocean where they shouldn't be. And the only way we're going to change that, I think, is through this through the whole holistic ecosystem approach. And governance is one thing. Another one's making it stick through giving that feeling of ownership to the next generation, where obviously education is going to take a huge role in it. And I think one of our challenges as an organisation that goes into these parts of the world is, in question to these panelists, is how do we give these laws and governance and feelings of inclusion teeth? What's our role as an organisation, our message to a way of calling out what we see and really taking things forward, accelerating the process? I guess it's a question for Dan and Glenn.
Yeah, and it seems like Jessica might have a response as well, so feel free, anyone, after Jessica.
Yes, I'd just like to quickly comment on that, in that, you know, rights of nature is not just a legal tool, but you could translate it to something more concrete as well. So maybe I have a suggestion for your organization as well, where you could play like a sort of play role, where you take the seed of nature and think from nature's perspective and in terms of its rights, instead of taking a human perspective. So maybe that might be something fun for you to do.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I'll take that back to the team.
Yeah, Jessica, that's exactly what I was going to say. We've been pioneering that work in New Zealand around Voice of the River. So we do have this legal personality mechanism in New Zealand, and that I think that I'm tentatively optimistic about that. But there were some conditions that had to be met that were quite unique for all of those, and where those don't exist, this idea of the voice of nature, and it's about how do we listen to her, how do we bring together those voices. And we've been doing it for rivers, the voice of the river, and we think about the health of the river, we think about how the river behaves, and we think about the stories that come in. And what it does is it shifts it from a rights-based adversarial, which is what our legal system is set up to do, is to pit one team against the other. And it says, actually, what would the river be saying? So what would the ocean be saying? What she's been screaming out to us for years, you know, if only we would listen. And I think this COVID lockdown, and I don't want to underplay the tragedy that is, she's healing herself as we just leave her be for this time. And I there's such a learning, I think, when we talk about education, if we can just learn from the ocean is our teacher. We just need to learn to listen.
Right, that's a great way to end on this, Dan. We're stopping in about a minute, so just to recap, you know, we've discussed that we really just need this deep systemic shift, right, in our values and our behavior, from this idea of ownership over the ocean to really responsibilities to listen and to hear its needs.